Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing. Mr. Odom, in your testimony, you painted what I think is a pretty absurdly rosy picture of the oil reserves contained in the Outer Continental Shelf. Listening to your testimony, one might think that we had several Saudi Arabias beyond our shores ready to be drilled and wash over us in low gas prices and rainbows. Of course, I have a different picture of that because the Energy Information Administration's 2007 report on what effects opening the entire OCS to drilling would have on energy production and prices states that such a policy, quote, would not have a significant impact on domestic crude oil and natural gas production or prices. And then the EIA testified before this committee last month, and they reaffirmed basically that statement again. But I'm concerned when, witnesses like yourself come before the committee and make these, incredibly rosy pictures because it affects our policy. I'm concerned when in 2004 your parent company was caught falsifying its oil reserves, was fined $150 million, faced criminal charges, and only recently settled shareholder lawsuits. Why would, based upon that experience, the committee necessarily believe what you are saying about oil reserves versus, predictions?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I think the good news is we have the ability to go back to the facts, and I think the easiest place for me to point to is the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico right now makes probably on the order of 1.4 million barrels a day. We have a project out there, we call it the Mars development, that itself makes a few 100,000 barrels a day. We have the Perdido project, which will come on in the next couple of months, which itself has the capacity to make 130,000 barrels a day. There are other examples from other industry players out there. My point is, 1.4 million barrels in its entirety right now from the Gulf of Mexico, and these discrete projects, which are the development opportunities we have out there, are adding significant pieces. So I would disagree fundamentally that this area where, the other characteristic we've seen in the Gulf of Mexico is the resource estimates have continued to grow as we've been there, done additional research, improved technology. Throughout the history of us being there, those resource estimates have grown. I would anticipate the exact same thing would happen in other areas of the OCS in the U.S.
Well,
so it can make a significant difference.
But there is a difference between a guess and what actually is a reserve, is it not?
There are very clear parameters on which the U.S. uses to define what a reserve is versus what resources are.
Let me ask you this. You, in your testimony, state that you believe that those who believe that there are serious environmental risks to offshore drilling have a, quote, outdated view of how the oil and gas industry operates today. Is it really so outdated in view of what just happened off the coast of Australia, that it spewed oil into the ocean? Do you have a picture of that? For over 10 weeks, and then caught fire before finally being plugged just 2 weeks ago. Is it really such an outdated view to believe that environmental effects of drilling, when it's estimated that 9 million gallons of oil spilled during that spill? Am I just being old-fashioned when that same drilling entity is working in U.S. waters today? I find it difficult to, maybe you can say that things are safer, but to suggest that, that there are no risks. And I want to end there with that question, and then, Mr. Amos, I want to ask you a question. I know that earlier I talked about what happened in Katrina and Rita. I was talking about both offshore and onshore spills. When the Coast Guard reported to Congress, not me, but the Coast Guard, that 8 million gallons of oil spilled onshore, and MMS reported that over 700,000 gallons spilled offshore, aren't the labyrinth of onshore pipelines and refineries directly linked to offshore production? If we didn't have the offshore production, would we necessarily have all of that additional risk? And shouldn't we count that as part of the overall risk factor. So if you both answer those questions, I'd appreciate it.
If I go back to the question of, do we have an outdated view? My point is this, that the technology has dramatically changed over the decades, and many people do have a view of how they saw the industry 20, 30 years ago, and I'm telling you, yes, it's very different today. And as we think about opening new areas of the OCS to exploration and production, I believe the way to look at it is to look at the latest developments by the industry in the current areas that are open, translate that to the new areas, because that's where you see the new technology. And in addition, all the mitigation techniques and other things that we've learned over these decades. So that's where my view, an outdated view, comes from.
Thank you, Senator. You're absolutely correct in your statement that the onshore and offshore infrastructure is essentially one interconnected facility, and it should be considered as such. The 1,700 homes in Louisiana that were inundated by crude oil from a spilled storage tank, those homeowners probably would not differentiate between where the oil came from and who owned it. So as we consider offshore drilling in new areas, it's not just the risk from what happens on multi-billion-dollar high-tech platforms that are operated by the biggest energy companies in the world. It's also the risk posed by the network of pipelines and onshore processing and storage facilities that are a requirement of supporting that offshore development. I'd also like to point out that I think you mentioned that the Norwegian company that was drilling off Australia when this blowout occurred is a well-respected global operator. They have a fleet of 41 drilling platforms around the world. They've targeted the Gulf of Mexico as an important area of business operations and have an office in Houston. And I think you mentioned they're currently under contract to drill in the Gulf of Mexico through 2012. So it's imperative that we understand exactly what caused that blowout and spill in Australia. But as we've seen in our investigations in recent years, every individual accident is a culmination of a unique chain of circumstances.
I appreciate it. I've asked Secretary Salazar to look into exactly that. Thank you very much, Mr.